you can do the next slide. So first off, for those of you that are kind of embedded within the dissemination implementation science fields, I would say most of the research, a lot of the research really does focus on the implementation side of things. And I think there's increasing awareness and a growing understanding of the importance of dissemination. So as things are being learned, how do we get things into practice? And so I think that's sort of the question that a number of us are involved in and really thinking about more is, let's focus on that D, the dissemination part of the D&I process. So with that, you can go to the next slide for a very, very abridged history of diffusion and dissemination within implementation science. So for those of you, again, that have been in the field, a few of these models probably look fairly familiar. On the upper right, we have Everett Rogers, the diffusion of innovations. And this is really looking at characteristics of the innovation as well as characteristics of the innovator, the people that may be more open or less open to new innovations. And so he has this curve of really distinguishing the innovators from the adopters and the kind of the laggards at the end. And that's how innovations spread throughout a system or an industry. Really a little bit more of a passive understanding of how information kind of moves through and change happens. But then also we have other models, Greenhalgh et al. In the upper right-hand corner of this, really is kind of this let it happen, make it happen, or help it happen and make it happen kind of continuum, and really thinking about and distinguishing kind of diffusion from more active dissemination strategies. And I think that's where we've been headed over the last few years, and really thinking about this active dissemination. And now we have these more nuanced models on the bottom there, the model for dissemination of research, which is really kind of identifying the importance of thinking about your audience, thinking about the messaging strategies, thinking about the vehicles and the mechanisms for getting information out to those audience members, really with this goal of trying to improve use. And so I think there's been this kind of evolution and thinking about dissemination, and that's part of what we're embedded in right now. You can move on to the next slide. So I just included a definition from the PCORI, which I kind of like about dissemination, that's really highlighting this notion of, thinking about your audience, your target audience, and really being very intentional about how to engage with them and share with them with this goal of use. I mean, I think that's really why we're all in this space in the first place, is we don't just do research for the sake of doing research. We want people to actually act on it and utilize it. And so I've included another figure here from another CASRIC colleague, Erica Grable. And this is, some of her work is really focusing on policymakers and how do they need to kind of receive and interact with research in order to make good policy, and really focusing on very nuanced dissemination strategies and thinking about how to connect with them. And even in the academic writ large, encouragement now to post things on Twitter or other forms of communication outside of kind of traditional publication channels. And so really thinking about dissemination more broadly. And from our perspective, these are all fantastic advancements and developments, thinking about how do we get information out in creative ways that meet the needs of the audience and how they're actually going to interact with information. You can go to the next slide. However, that's I think there's an opportunity to expand our views of dissemination. And this is already underway at the NIH level, as far as not just sharing findings of research, but actually sharing data. And so this is a little bit of a shift and an expansion, thinking about dissemination of actually sharing data for others to utilize. And the NIH level for research, this has now become a requirement expectation. And at the end of a study, data gets uploaded into various repositories so that other academics and theoretically other community members could access this information. And that's an important step. I think that really does facilitate this notion of transparency and replicability and extension of research to ask new questions from old data. But also I think we now have other opportunities to think about not just sharing data at the end of a study, but possibly midstream or sharing it with community members more directly and really trying to engage with them at that level. And that's really where the focus of this, the time that we'll be spending with you is focusing on that aspect of data sharing. And there's new opportunities and tools to make that happen. But I think some of the things that can accomplish with this is really to engage with community stakeholders in a different way. And instead of the historical partnership, and I've been involved with many different community partnerships, and we try to have kind of balance of power and responsibilities, but it's traditionally the academic team that holds the data. When you hold the data, you hold a lot of the power. So even if you're sharing preliminary results, maybe getting some feedback, and then taking that suggestion and going back to the data to look at it differently, there's still a little bit of imbalance. So some of the data sharing capabilities, actually, one of the phrases is democratizing data dissemination, and really kind of getting information to other people, and trying to, and some of the phrases, we have citizen science, where we're bringing other people into the research process. I know, many people during the pandemic, there was an explosion of dashboards with data information all over many different settings. And people were engaging with information in a different way. And then from that, you're asking different questions, and people can think about information in ways that they didn't have the capability of doing that previously. So you can go to the next slide. So that's really a big setup for what we're going to be sharing about, and really kind of building on Kate's experience doing this type of work with our local BHS system, behavioral health system. This is, I would say, still of an emerging area, and especially I think this notion of engaging community partner for really having them be more actively involved in the research piece is I think quite a new thing that we're still learning how to do this and do it well. But there are a lot of tools to kind of make this happen in a more easy fashion than there were even just a few years ago. And so with that, I think I'll just kick it over to you, Kate, and you can share your wonderful wisdom and experience.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you again to the organizers of the seminar for inviting me today. I'm actually very excited to have the opportunity to speak here. So I would say prior to joining CASRIC about 4 years ago, dissemination for me was a lot like David just described it. It was kind of an afterthought in my work. I wasn't doing it with a whole lot of intention, and I knew that it deserved more of that. And it actually really bothered me because I felt like it was a missed opportunity, right, to make an impact and use research and data to at least try to empower and engage our communities. But since joining this team at CASRIC, my work has increasingly shifted towards community-oriented data dissemination. And I would say now it's actually the part of my work that I both love the most and that I'm lucky enough to spend a lot of my time doing. So it's been a real pleasure to be here. So the audience for the projects that I actually work on, they're typically our partners at San Diego County Behavioral Health Services. And so for the extent of this presentation, I'll just refer to that group as BHS. And they're also our external community partners like community mental health workers and our behavioral health advocates. And, static reportings have served and will continue to serve a really important purpose in communicating information to these partners. But as David said, I was increasingly finding examples of data dashboards and dynamic reports all over the place. And I was starting to interact with those a lot in my own work. Sandag's data surfers and the CDC, and over here, this great interactive report from the Trevor Project. There was just like really exciting stuff coming at me. But not only was I starting to use that, our partners at BHS were starting to ask for more interactive data tools to disseminate data, and they were really pushing us in some exciting ways. So being an applied researcher without any experience in front-end development, I assumed that to achieve any level of sophistication with this, you would really need some specialized front-end developers and software engineers, and that just wasn't in the scope of the sorts of projects that we were doing to bring in that sort of support staff. But I began to wonder, are there tools? Are there alternatives? Are there tools that like a typical applied researcher like myself could use to disseminate interactive data and to kind of engage communities? And so I was looking for tools that would enable dynamic exploration of data. So instead of the static reports, I wanted them to be interactive. And I wanted it to be tailored for researchers that had limited programming experience, which I certainly fall into that category. I'm not a front-end engineer. I'm not a software developer. We needed tools that were budget friendly, that were open source or affordable licensing. And we were looking for kind of a minimal time commitment to integrate these tools into our work. And I was actually really excited to find that there are some tools out there that were pretty easy for us to use, and they ticked a lot of those boxes. So today, I've been invited to share a few examples of projects I've been developing that use these tools to disseminate data, both to our community partners and to the general public. And my hope really is just to invite some creative thinking and discussion around dissemination today. I imagine and hope that some folks are already using these or other tools, and we'd love to hear from you, hear what your experiences have been. If you're not already using some of this stuff, I hope that you might just consider it next time you're faced with a dissemination task, because as David has said, we really do want a message that it is really accessible for researchers to integrate some of this stuff. I do want to note that my intent today is not to cover or offer any sort of comprehensive rundown of tools. I'm not endorsing specific libraries or softwares. I'm not a software specialist. I'm not the foremost authority on dissemination software. There's a lot of tools out there, and they all have pros and cons. And so for anyone who's interested in exploring this space, I would say look around and see what makes sense for your projects and your objectives. There's a lot of options out there. I also want to say that I think an entire other topic, which is fascinating and important, is how we ensure these tools are really meeting the needs of the communities and that the tools make sense to the communities. I see Dr. Danielle Fettis is here, who she's been helping us in some of our own projects try to make sure that we have really taken that community perspective into the tools that we're creating. And I think as the dissemination field kind of moves in this direction, that's going to be increasingly important, but it's beyond the scope of today's talk. We're really just looking at some tools that people can use. Okay, so what are these tools that I keep talking about? We have 3 tools that I want to speak to, and then I want to show a quick example of how some of us more novice coders can really leverage the generative AI stuff that's coming out to make some of these tools more accessible to us. So I'm going to show some drag and drop dashboarding tools like Power BI and Tableau, and then move to some code-based web applications, Shiny and Plotly Dash, and then interactive parameterized reports. So that would be like our Markdown, Quarto, Jupyter Notebook. If you don't know what any of those things are, that's fine. I didn't really a year ago, so we're going to move slowly through this. Okay, let's start with dashboarding tools. So a little over 2 years ago, we developed and launched a series of interactive dashboards with BHS that were public facing. And this was part of a larger initiative to identify and address, excuse me, behavioral health disparities in San Diego County. Sorry. And it came out of a real commitment by BHS leadership and our team at UCSD to make disparities data accessible to the general public. And this initiative was based on principles of data equity, accessibility, and transparency. So to develop the dashboards, we prepared all the data in SQL and R. And if you're not familiar with R, it's just an open source programming language. It's really good for statistics and data visualization. And we built the dashboards in Power BI. So like Tableau, BI is a graphical user interface or a GUI-based tool. And that just means that it primarily operates through drag and drop interface. So you don't need to do any coding to use BI, which is appealing to a lot of maybe more general researchers. And finally, to make the dashboards accessible to the community, we embedded them on a website we built. And we happen to use Wix. I know that BI has options for just sharing dashboards and publishing as well, and that there's lots of other kind of software out there for developing websites. Okay, so I just quickly want to demonstrate what the end product looked like, just so you can kind of see how it all came together. So again, this is the home site, and we designed this in Wix. And once you're in, you have the option to choose from one of 6 different data dashboards. All the dashboards, like I said, were constructed in Power BI, and they were embedded to the website using iframes. That's not tricky. The embedding codes are automatically generated when you publish reports in BI, and there's a little option in Wix to just stick them in there. So if we enter the dashboard, there's these kind of typical filters along the left panel, and the goal here, of course, was to kind of transparently share data with community members so they could really explore these issues on their own. So we worked hard to keep the design clean and simple, and the same design is replicated across all the dashboards. And we also programmed some dynamic descriptions for each of the graphs. So these are written interpretations. Again, the hope was that it might make the data a little more accessible. this has been a really fun project, but it's continuing to develop, and we're continuing to get feedback on ways to make these dashboards more usable to the community. Okay. That was the first tool. Does anyone have any questions about these kind of GUI-based tools? Okay.
Kate, I do, if I may,
yes.
Could you tell me for kind of investment of getting proficient or functional with this, how many hours would you guess for someone who is not tech savvy?
Yes, that's such a great question. I think Power BI and Tableau, because they don't require coding, you can do a lot with a little. And I feel like there's a pretty good return, at least my experience, you know, without a lot of time investment. But then you kind of reach this point where you're starting to try to do more. And that's where I feel like it got trickier for me, if that makes sense. So like right out of the box, you can accomplish a whole lot. But if you're really trying to make something specialized, then it became a little bit time consuming, I guess. And I think in part that kind of speaks to the point that I want to bring up right now, which is, so because they don't require programming, you can do a lot really quickly. But then I kept running up against customization challenges, right? So I was trying to adjust some sort of element or build in a new functionality, and I'd find out that the feature wasn't supported, and there really wasn't a whole lot that you could do. So this often kind of resulted in these time-consuming workarounds or kind of just accepting this reduced functionality, and I didn't want to do that. And I'd also been really spoiled by working in this kind of open source world with R, where Stack Overflow, these forums for asking questions and getting responses. I'm terribly sorry, my dog seems to be having a moment over here. It was just, you couldn't get the same kind of support with Power BI. I couldn't. There was no forum to ask questions and get things answered. So the next time we had the opportunity to create an interactive dashboard, we decided to experiment with some open source packages. This is a package called RShiny. So if you're not an R user, if you're a Python user, you would look for like Plotly Dash in Python. And like I said, these applications are built via code, but don't be scared off if you're a novice to R or Python. I'm not an advanced programmer, and you don't need high-level programming skills. And I hope to convince you all of that actually a little later in the presentation with our demo that we're going to do. So essentially how it works is you create a Shiny app from within R, you run it, and there it is on your local machine. But you still need to make it available to folks to access. And that can happen on your own servers behind firewalls, and you can deploy it to the web, or you can deploy it to the web via Shiny Apps.io, which is it's a cloud-based platform for hosting applications. Shiny and R are completely free, and Shiny Apps.io is free up to a point, and then you can pay for more advanced options. So it's really great because you don't have to deal with any of the server infrastructure on your own, like managing instances and caches and all this stuff that comes up with apps. I have no idea what any of it means, and I would never be successful at deploying an app to my own server. But you don't have to do that if you're using this package, and I'm sure there's other packages out there that offer kind of the same support. Okay, so let's take a quick look at an example of something that we built with Shiny Apps. So this was for a request that BHS had, and they were interested in a tool that they could use to help ensure service provision was informed by data and based in cultural and regional considerations, which is like just a dream project to get to work on something like that. It was really cool. So for this, instead of designing public-facing dashboards for generalized users, we were designing a much more specialized dashboard for BHS partners. And I think you can see that straight away. It looks like there's a lot more going on here. And likely no one would really be set loose to use this tool on their own. There would be trainings and supports around it. But I'll just quickly kind of show you what you're able to do. So again, this is the interface. And so instead of analyzing in R, exporting and building in BI, and then building in Wix, it was all built via a few scripts in R. And so the whole thing executes with the click of a button. And users are they're looking at different indicators geographically. They're using filters to find regions of interest. And then a few nice features for the dissemination, which this allows is that you can have these data tables that are interactive. They can sort in real time. And then you have the lovely option to let users download the data, which kind of David was speaking about, like just getting the data in the hands of people. And then, we built in some pretty standard bar charts and just other features like that. It was all, if you didn't know that we were using Shiny, you might think that this was just created in Power BI. The end product isn't dramatically different. So let's see. I want to say anything else here. I think that is sufficient. Any questions about that tool before I kind of go on to the last tool I wanted to talk about today? Kind of these web-based applications. Okay. Excellent.
Kate,
Yeah.
Kate, before you go on, I was just curious for the last tool that you used or you showed us, where are the data sources coming from? It looks like there's sort of a combination of different sources that you're pulling from.
Yeah. I mean, and so a lot of that is just kind of the data wrangling that happens before you even load your data into this. Most of that data, Nicole, is ACS data from the US Census. Okay. And so it had already been kind of downloaded, but then once you have the data in there, like those bar charts where people, I don't know if you could tell, but those are reactive to the selections the user's making. So the aggregation of the data is happening right there in real time, through the tool, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. It was very cool to see. Very custom.
Thanks. Yeah, it still needs more work. We're still working, actually. That's been a cool process because we're working right now with BHS to make sure this tool is gonna actually meet their needs. So we're doing a lot of back and forth. They're testing, they're giving us feedback, we're revising. So that's not quite finished yet, to be honest. I hope it gets better. Always hoping, right? Okay, so let's talk about dynamic reports, because I think that this for me has been the coolest new tool to start playing with, because I think the possibilities are really endless once you get into here. So increasingly, I was becoming concerned that end users might need more guidance in using and interpreting interactive data, right? This actually came a lot from my own experience as I was trying to interact with some of these dashboards online. I could find the applications to be really confusing. And like, I'm a research data analyst, right? Like I work with data all the time. And I was looking at these dashboards sometimes. And I was like, I don't know how to run these filters. I don't know what the data are telling me. And I was starting to worry that if these tools aren't done well, that interactive data could actually make the data less interpretable and less accessible than just our static reports. And so I was looking for a tool that would kind of marry that interactive features of the dashboards and the web applications with the framing and the communication that can come through like more traditional static reporting. And that's when I started playing with dynamic reporting tools like Markdown and Quarto. So if you're not familiar, this is how it works. The reports are actually authored in like a programming language, in this case, R. And I read somewhere recently that it's the combination of prose and code, and that's exactly what it is. So the code to produce your figures, your tables, your visualizations, everything, it's all embedded within the report. And then you render the report, and you can render it as an HTML, a PDF, a Word doc. I love the HTML rendering because you can keep all of your interactive components there, including dashboards that users can interact with, and data tables that people can download. So again, I'll show a quick example of a report that I recently made with R Markdown. So this is a technical report we wrote to a company, a composite index that we created. And I'll say all of the themes are actually already written into Markdown. So you can choose some very lovely themes. You don't have to spend a lot of time formatting any of this. And this is kind of how it works, right? So you have this interactive table of contents over here. And I might choose to look at the discussion, the results section. And then you can choose to go to different sections. And so I'm going to pause here. So here you see we have this like nice written context, but we also have these tables down here. These are just correlation tables. I love that you can use these tab sets. And so you can put so much data into these reports, way more than you could put into a traditional PDF, but it's kind of contained in a way that's more usable and where users can kind of be interacting with the document to see what they want. And then, like I said, you also have the ability to put any sort of visualization you want. So these are maps, but you can zoom in on the maps. You can hover, you can interact with the maps. Here are some dumbbell plots that we made. And again, users can hover on the points to get more information from the dumbbell plots. And then, of course, as I said, we have these great data tables where you can filter and query the data in real time and sort it. And then, of course, we have the options to download the data so users can start interacting with it straight away. So I think this was a really fun report to build using Markdown. I think another kind of benefit of this report that wasn't immediately obvious to me was that, sorry, one second, folks. Let me go on to this slide. It wasn't immediately obvious to me that this would be such a good way to communicate information with our partners. So as we were building this index, I was reaching out to the senior epidemiologists at BHS, and they were looking at this kind of living document, and we could make decisions about dropping indicators or adding indicators. And because this report is programmed into kind of my base code, anytime I changed anything in my code, this report automatically updates. So in terms of time saving as a researcher, it wasn't the reason that I did this, but it ended up just becoming immediately apparent to me after having had the experience of going through and updating tables when something in your underlying data changes, you know, or updating language, it can just be so time consuming. And so yeah, in terms of workflow, these kinds of reports are just, I think they're just fabulous, and I plan to use them, you know, a lot more. Are there any other questions on this component? Sorry, before we go on to another feature of these reports. Okay. So another thing that Markdown supports is parameterized reporting. So that means a single document can generate multiple reports based on different input parameters. So for example, users could select inputs and generate custom reports by community group, region, time period, really anything that you want. So let's go back to that service planning tool, and I'll show you how this can actually function in real time. So let's say that the user is just interested in one geographic region. This is National City. It's a sub-regional area in central San Diego. They can go to download a key findings report from within this tool. The report downloads, you open it up, and then you have this lovely document that now is updated just for National City. And all of the data and statistics in it have been updated, including the language, to just represent whatever the user is interested in. Which I love as a way of kind of providing just like a little bit more support around the data that you're presenting in a dashboard. And again, you can have all of the same elements. You can see I really love dumbbell plots. There they are again. But you know, I understand that like you might be working on projects where the unit of analysis is not the geography, but don't feel like limited by that. I would encourage you to think about ways that you might slice and dice into subpopulations, community groups, whatever, whoever might be interested in getting like kind of a specialized report that can be built in, which I think is a really interesting idea. Okay, any questions on the Markdown before we move to tips for tool integration? Okay. All right. So since I really hope to communicate today how possible it is for a general applied researcher like myself to integrate these tools, I want to demonstrate how helpful GenAI can be in this process. So in the last several months, I began utilizing GenAI for a lot of coding support. And I know I've heard the critiques too. Like I've heard a lot of people poo-poo the code that it produces. And I'm sure for like really sophisticated programmers, it's not especially helpful. But for me as an intermediate coder, it's been a complete game changer in what I can do. In particular, I've been really impressed with its ability to support Shiny applications. So I want to quickly demonstrate how this works, just in case anyone in the forum today hasn't actually had the chance to see this or to interact with it. So I use ChatGPT, not an endorsement. There's lots of other bots and options out there. I find it to be particularly helpful for coding. I think that it does really well with coding. And so an example prompt that I might give ChatGPT would be just to write a simple Shiny app for me. And I would say, I want to make a scatter plot using one of R's built-in data sets. And I want to create drop-down menus to pick the X and Y variables. So this would be a really simple Shiny application. So I'm going to show you a live recording of what ChatGPT produces. When you go to the website, you just enter that prompt exactly like I put there into the message box. And it's in its traditionally friendly manner. It says, certainly, let me get right on that. And this is where the first time I saw this, I was just kind of blown away. It just starts writing the code. Like, that's it. I didn't realize until I started playing with it that that's actually what it could do. And you just click to copy the code. And I will show you, I went straight over and opened up a Shiny app in R. I use RStudio as my IDE. So this is the interface for R. Here's my Shiny app, empty and waiting. And all I did was Control V, what it had given me. I hit to run the app. And there you go. Like, it did it. It worked. I think it's really amazing. And it did a pretty good job. But I think what's really cool about it is that these environments now are kind of interactive. So once you start this prompt and this discussion with your chatbot, you can go back and ask for revisions and modifications. So the next prompt I gave it was to change the scatter plot points to red. And then I was like, what would be really cool is if I could embed this app in a markdown report, and then put some user-friendly language around how to interpret it. So I'm not going to show you the generated response from ChatGPT. I just hope that you'll trust that I didn't modify what it gave me. I just opened back in R the markdown document. Again, Control V, what it had given me, and hit to run the document. And it takes just a second for it to render. And there it came. So now you have your HTML markdown document with an interactive dashboard in it. And some language. I wouldn't ever just go with this language, but I wanted to, of course, point out that that is another feature that people are excited about is ChatGPT's ability to like create text and content as well. Okay. So let's see. Are there any questions about ChatGPT before we move on? We're not exactly leaving it behind yet. Okay. So one of the things that I like about this kind of simple example of the embedded app in a markdown report is that these kind of interactive components can be very simple little endeavors. Like, we don't always need to build these complex apps like the one that I was demoing before, where there's maps and filters and downloadable reports. So I can imagine situations where I would love to share a very simple dashboard with community or research partners, perhaps something as simple as that interactive bar plot or scatter plot. And these can be tools, I think, for engaging partners, during the research process. So I can envision opportunities to look at these dashboards together with people and try to elicit what the key findings are, and formulate questions together. And of course, we don't have an interest as researchers in building any sort of interactive plots based on R's built-in data set MT-cars. But what you can do with ChatGPT is you can prompt it with the name of your own data frame and the name of your variables. And once you have a little bit of code, it's very, very helpful at modifying that code and fixing it and finding your errors and explaining it to you. So it's a good friend to take general applied researchers to push us further into this space, I think. I do want to make an important note about ChatGPT. I'm sure you all know that it's not a protected environment. You wouldn't want to put anything confidential or protected into the message box. In fact, that's why I've personally been shying away from using, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Copilot or these other Gen AI tools that are kind of integrated into your IDE. These tools are coming online really quickly. They're expanding the space in really interesting ways, but I think as ethical researchers, we have to proceed cautiously and with awareness of the limitations, both in terms of data security and of some of the content biases that we've been hearing about integrated into these tools. So honestly, in terms of content bias, I'm less concerned when it comes to things like coding. I would be, more concerned with other uses of this tool. And of course, the platforms that I showed earlier, for deploying applications to the web, those are not HIPAA compliant. So the Shiny Apps IO, once you take it out from behind your own server and you're putting out there publicly, you would have to be very careful if you were working with any sensitive data. So that's actually, it produces complexity for those of us that do work with sensitive data. So in the first project that I showed you, we actually had to do a lot of suppression of small counts and complementary suppression to be in compliance with our data sharing rules. This is a screenshot of what happens when you select outcomes that have been suppressed because of client confidentiality. And it's important to note on these tools that the filtering, it can't just happen on the front end. You just can't set a rule for the front end to say, don't show any counts less than 5, because you're loading the data up there and there's always a possibility that someone tricky could get their hands on it. So it is a bit heavier lift if you need to consider protected data, but I would say it's definitely not limiting. And in my opinion, it's really worth pursuing. So that concludes my little tour of tools. Before I hand it back to David, I wanted to quickly acknowledge my colleague and lead research data analyst, Antron. He was very essential in helping to develop the projects that we looked at today. So with that, David, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. I appreciate that. And then every time you and I have talked in the preparation of this, I always learn new things and think about other applications of this, since you're way further down this journey than I am myself. And I'll even just say, listening to you talk, I'm thinking about different community meetings that I'm in where I'm presenting data. And then someone will ask me a question about, well, what about this group? Or what have you looked at this? And a lot of times we have done that behind the scenes, and I need to remember what was it when we looked at it. But how awesome would it be to say, that's a great question, and actually do kind of a dynamic data examination in the room with the individuals. I think that just brings so many interesting opportunities for kind of a data engagement, data sharing. So I really appreciate that. So just I want to leave a few minutes for questions with Kate, but just in general, just to highlight, I think there's a lot of, as you can see, there's a lot of new tools out there. I think there is this kind of initial barrier to entry to just make that first leap, but then it seems like from there, between ChatGPT and a number of the other products that are really designed for easing someone into this space. So really a lot of the benefits we've talked about: transparency, accessibility, trying to get data to populations and communities that maybe don't have an opportunity to kind of interact with this type of work, and really kind of helping get at that notion of health equity and health disparities. And one thing for me also, since I do a fair amount of the static reporting with our BHS partners, is really thinking about shortening these time cycles of how quickly you can get at analysis. Or we get a new data extract and something changed by 4N out of a 10,000. Now you got to redo all of your charts and tables that have been done on a previous draft of a report. So as far as workflow and other things, it seems really beneficial. But as Kate said, this is a kind of an emerging space. Lots to be learned, lots to learn about how to actually do this well with community members. Because I think if we just build something and say, hey, use it, that's not going to get us very far. And so really having our community partners in mind, unless you're doing something where it truly is more of a general community education, then interacting with certain stakeholders, getting feedback. And that's a lot of what Kate and her team did. throughout that process, is getting some select feedback throughout the way. So with that, hopefully we've accomplished our goal of getting people interested about the opportunities, thinking about next steps, how it might apply to their work. I'll pause right there and turn it over and see if there are specific questions that people might have of Kate in particular.
Hi, can I ask a question? Thank
Go
you
for it.
for that presentation. That was awesome. I don't know this literature well, but have these interactive dashboards been used as an audit and feedback type of intervention?
So I'll say just something real briefly. I would say from a literature perspective, it's very kind of emerging. And so there are people that are talking about this. I know some of it has popped up in the context of the pandemic and really trying to utilize information to get back to policymakers and community members. So I would say this is, I don't think there's any like really solid research on that itself, but I think this is kind of an emerging space where that can be an opportunity.
Thanks.
There's a question in the chat here from Amir. Do you want me to share it with you, or do you
Sure.
want to take a chance? Okay. So Amir, if you'd like to unmute and share it, you're welcome to.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you so much for the very informative and impressive presentation. So my question is about the strengths and shortcomings of these different programs. So I have a little bit of experience using Power BI, and I'm really enjoying this tool, but I've never used Shiny or R Markdown, especially for R Markdown, creating interactive web pages. I used R Markdown to create just static reports.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder, based on your experience, what are the strengths or shortcomings when comparing these different tools? So for example, in Power BI, one of the things that I use a lot is you upload a custom map, let's say a word map or like a floor map,
Mm-hmm.
and then you put the data, and if people go to a specific portion or section of the map or image, then something pops up like numbers for that specific room or that word or that section of the map. So comparing Power BI, Shiny, and R Markdown, what are like the biggest strengths or the opposite side, the shortcomings for these different tools? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a really great question, and something that I've thought about a lot. So I've also built maps in Power BI. I think I used the Mapbox plugin. I think that's what it was. And I've done it now also in Shiny apps. So I'll kind of fall back on what I said before. I feel like, the first time I built one of those maps in Power BI and could just see what it did straight out of the box, I was like, I thought it was pretty impressive, a lot of bells and whistles. But then I wanted it to do something else. Like I didn't like the way that it was zooming, or I wanted, I didn't want it to zoom out all over the world. I wanted to limit that zoom, and I can't remember what else, but there were these little things that I was like, I don't like that, and I can't change it. So it was super quick and easy to build that map and have it work, but I couldn't do much beyond that. You can achieve that same level of sophistication in Shiny apps. Particularly, this is an example too, where I would say to utilize, maybe coding support. So if you get your leaflet, just your basic leaflet code written to bring in a leaflet map, you can ask then for support from GPT. Hey, here's my code. Can you please make it so that it will not zoom out all over the country, and it will update your code for you to get kind of to that level of sophistication that you can kind of get out of the box, and then you can go beyond it, right? So, I'm not going to lie, anything with coding, there's going to be a learning curve, but it sounds like you're already using R. You're there. Like, I would say you would be there to integrate. that very seamlessly. Other pros and cons, like I said, there's not a great amount of community support I found around Power BI to get those questions answered. You know, I'm just a big fan of open source. So not only is anything possible, but it's free and it's accessible, and I love just the concept of it. So I feel like those products just end up being really, really impressive because there's so many contributors. But yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
It looks like I'll just read Mary's question just for time. So Mary asks, are the original or raw data maintained on secured servers, and then the systems draw from them?
Yeah. So for the stuff that I was putting up in Shiny apps, there was no protected data in that. It's all publicly available. So I didn't have to address that. For the stuff that I was putting up in Power BI, I never published anything that had low count data that anyone could see. So when I went to publish Power BI to get the embedding codes that I needed to put it on Wix, that data had already gone through all of the suppression. And I had done that through wrangling in R. And so our protected data never leaves. It never leaves the Casric server. It never gets attached to any of the Power BI reports. I feel like there's still, I still feel like it's hard to get answers to questions about data security with some of these new tools. And I'm not sure that the answers always are there yet. And, you know, in terms of what you can do and what you can't do, like, can I start to use some of this coding support in my IDE? I'm not sure. It's confusing. And so I always err on the side of just protect that data to the utmost. Don't put anything out there until the space moves a little further and I really understand it a little bit better.
And then Kara asks a question, and I know that we're almost out of time, so if it's not a quick question, we can send it to you, Kate and David. Mm-hmm. Could the dashboards be integrated with other data sources like the CDC's GIS dashboard?
So integrated with, you mean bring that data in and start visualizing that data in your own dashboard?
Yeah, so also like bringing in like the regional, but also having like a national piece as well.
Absolutely. You can put it all in there. On the composite index we made, there was, I think, 15 or 20 different data sources that we were pulling in from and integrating. I mean, that's wrangling that you have to do kind of, you know, in your other software. But once, you know, the sky is the limit. You can put anything in there that you can find.
So I guess a follow-up, just to confirm, you're not pulling live data from somebody else's site. You're pulling down like a flat file, and then that's what you're working with is static data from somebody else's, or are you actually integrated with a kind of like if you're connecting to the Census Bureau that has like its own API. Kind of interactive and updated data?
Is that a question for me, David?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, my own curiosity and follow-up.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. You can do it either way. Okay. You run into, my understanding is that you can run into bottlenecks on the efficiency of your app and the running time if you try to draw directly, depending on the size of the data you're drawing. But it does support that. I know Shiny App supports that, you know, to draw data in via an API or something else, you know. I can't speak to that in Power BI. I've never tried that. I don't know, maybe someone else knows the answer, but I also know we're over time.
Well, maybe I'll have to unfortunately wrap us up. Kate and David, you're getting a lot of praise for the helpful examples, especially with the Gen AI. So thank you so much. This was a wonderful discussion. We may need a part 2, so stay tuned for that. We will post the slides and the recording of this hopefully in the next week. And I imagine Kara will send out a tweet and sort of a listserv post to remind you how to access these. Thank you so much, Kate and David. Really appreciate you and your time. And we'll see you, hopefully many of you, next month, October 19th, for our next DISC seminar. Thanks, everyone. Happy autumn. We're almost there.
Thank you for having us.
Take care.